Hold on tight for the next hour. You're entering into a place, a zone called the alternative to the alternative media. It's a place, a special place where even truth seekers fear to tread.
All right, people, let's move like we've got a purpose.
Affirmative.
Okay, glad you're back on the Investigative Journal. We're 9 days into February in this year 2017 on our calendar. I'm Greg Anthony here, and boy, we got a full show for you today. A lot to cover. Nazis in our country, 10 facts you have to know about the Jesuits. I made a prediction that within 5 years we'll be in World War III. I'll back that up today, but before we do that, let me give you my Jesuit quote of the day. And this comes from General Sherman during the Civil War, and it's a most appropriate quote. But let me say this. People asked me the other day, what's the biggest threat facing America? Oh, I've heard so many things. ISIS, education, the lack thereof. And then I said to myself, let's get more specific. And it is incredulous to me and most shocking to see the media and the world and the people I speak to stampeding to endorse the praise of Pope Francis. And I really don't have any words to describe this epidemic of memory that we have towards Rome and the Jesuits. Now, long before I started studying the Bible, and I do that a lot now, I was in Rome as a journalist, and I was an atheist when I went there. And to be honest with you, when I was there, the first glimpse I took of St. Peter's Square, I said to myself, well, maybe I can get back to my roots as a Catholic. And I honestly said that. But as I covered story after story and watched the media in both France and Germany and Italy report on the Vatican scandal I saw there, the bank scandal, I began to look deeply into really what they were all about. And instead of drawing myself closer to the Vatican, I drew farther and farther away and actually see them as the biggest threat facing our country and the world today. And the biggest threat facing our education system is not understanding this, and I call it an epidemic of a memory loss towards Rome and her Jesuits. All you have to do is start studying history and realize nothing has changed. And that is what I consider to be the biggest threat. So let me give you a quote by General Sherman regarding the Jesuits, and he said this, quote, I would remind you of Webster's definition of a Jesuit, a designer, an intriguer. If the Church of Rome prevailed, the Pope would be the universal king. The Jesuits are here to plot and scheme, and if possible, take from us the noble heritage of our civil and religious freedom. The rules of the Jesuit order justify theft, licentiousness, lying, false witness bearing, suicide, and the murder of parents and other relatives. The greatest crimes in history committed against individuals and nations have been committed by the Jesuits. Wherever Jesuits are, they have the torch to burn, the sword to slay, the Inquisition to torture. They are the enemies of Bible-believing Christianity. They live for conquest, fortune, and glory. You can find that in General Sherman's son, The Life of Thomas Ewing Sherman, S.J., Joseph T. Durkin, S.J., New York, 1959, page 186. So, nothing's changed. That was written in 1960, 2 years, well, was it 2 years before the Jesuits and our government plotted to kill Kennedy? When he made a number of statements about secret societies. There were a whole bunch of things that they didn't like because basically Kennedy, as the first Catholic president, card-carrying Catholic president, backstabbed them when he made statements like, no pope will control this country, we're going to get rid of the Federal Reserve, and we're going to go back to the gold standard. Wow, that scared the hell out of the Jesuits. and basically would not allow Cardinal Spellman into the White House. He had to go, and he did quickly. And we're still to this day challenged. Many people are challenged on who really killed him. All we have to do is go back and read history regarding the Jesuits' plot and how they killed Lincoln. But that's been hidden. So we have a memory loss here. And what I want to do first is, should I give you the 10 facts you have to know about the Jesuits? Yes. Then I want to get into, I made a statement, we're going to be in a world war within 5 years. And I'll back it up by statements made by one of the senior White House counselors to Trump, and that's quite interesting, so we have to do that. So let me give you the 10 facts you need to know about the Jesuits, just to refresh your memory, because there's a big memory loss in this country. Let's do that right now. Okay, let's get at it right now. But let me go back a little bit first and tell you what I used to do, and I'm going to start doing it starting in March. Once a week, I used to contact one of the Jesuit provincials in our country. They've divided our country into 10 regions, which report to one region, then report to Rome. Very organized. They've done this around the world. In fact, the UN has divided the world into 10 different regions, and I don't think it's a coincidence. And years ago, I used to contact them and ask to talk to the Jesuit provincial in one of the 10 regions. And I never could get to the provincial, so I would have to talk to their communications director. And I would bluntly ask him a question in history or a question regarding Jesuit intrigue and see what they would say. And I had some remarkable responses, none of which agreed with me. And I find it interesting how they double talk. So maybe I'll start doing that again. And what I did at that time was I asked if I could get him to, I'd put him right on the air so you could hear. And I'll see if I could do that. If not, I will tape it and put it on the air. So maybe we'll do that again to see how they're doing, because it's been a while since I've contacted them. And I found out years ago when I was contacting them, they knew. I asked them, do you know who I am? And they'd say no. And then I'd call them back 2 weeks later, and they said, yes, we found out, we've read some of your stuff. And boy, I'll tell you something, you are a misguided Catholic. We wish you back into the church. And I would say thank you for your caring about me, and I'd move on. But anyway, let's. One of the biggest facts, there's 10 of these, and boy, I hope I can get to some of my other stuff on the show today, but let's start with 10 facts you need to know, just to refresh your memory, because you really need to know. Most of the world's oblivious to how they operate, and that's, remember the quote I gave you by Michelangelo Tamburini, the Jesuit general back in the 1700s, who say, we control the world from this office, and that's Borgo Santo Spirito Cinque in Rome, and I've been by that many times. And if you go in there and try to talk to them, it's like trying to get into Fort Knox. Not an open, I used to go in there and say, hey, I'm a Catholic. Can I talk to a priest? I mean, I thought you have an open door policy. Oh, boy, an open door policy. Give me a break. They got cameras and, they want to know. It's incredible. But the Jesuits are a secret organization. But Michelangelo Tamburini said, we control right from this very office the world, China, and everywhere around the world without anybody knowing how they do it. And that's their game. And Kennedy pointed that out, secret society speech, go to that. But anyway, one fact that always interested me was this one, and it's the most important part of our history that's, I think, been changed and even falsified by many Jesuit people who have come forward with big, huge anti-Jesuit books who don't want to face this and at least talk about it, and have criticized me for even talking about it. And it was during the time of Pope Clement XIV when he supposedly abolished the Jesuits as a society in 1773. And in the years prior to that, during this the Revolutionary War and everything, much word was getting out to our country that the Jesuits were being suppressed, so don't worry about them as an enemy. And I think that was purposeful. You know, if you ever read Sun Tzu's Art of War, make your enemy think you're weak, and then you can get away with murder. Well, anyway, we've talked many times about all the nations that the Jesuits were kicked out. But history, at least not even history books in college, but when you want to go and study the history of the church, they say that the 18th century Catholic nations were tired of meddling the Jesuits into their national affairs. They were so infuriated against the Jesuits that they demanded the Roman Catholic Church abolish them once and for all. Sufficient political pressure was brought to bear on Pope Clement XIII. However, he passed away before he could do anything about it. The task of abolishing the Society of Jesus then fell on his successor, Clement XIV. As Clement XIV signed the decree abolishing the Jesuit order, he said, "I have signed my death warrant." Within 9 months, he was dead. Many contemporaries considered his death a case of poisoning and suspected the Jesuits were responsible. But this whole during this time, remember the time frame here, in the right before our country was officially formed. Now, isn't it interesting that in the early 1800s, the Jesuits were miraculously reestablished? But there's a whole series of things during that period of time that I think went on that never gets reported. One, I think on paper the Jesuits were abolished, but they were stronger than ever. And even their Jesuit general, who was supposedly put in prison, and I know where that prison is. There's a little tunnel. You can go right to the Vatican, or get close to it. You go into those places. There was a place where they would put him. Well, then they said he was dead. I believe that they faked his death, and that was Lorenzo Ricci, and he was one of our founding fathers, and really was one of the architects of how to get Britain and France to fight against each other and create the Revolutionary War and bring about this supposed freedom of this country of freedom through the Constitution, which in essence allowed Catholicism to enter when many of the patriots never wanted Rome here to begin with. They weren't even allowed to vote or hold office in the beginning. And I believe their plan was to sneak in here and take over, and look at how they've grown in our country. So that's the one fact you got to research. And I believe a lot is hidden. And secondly, I believe George Washington was working with them. I believe Benjamin Franklin was working with them. So when we say we have to go back to the Founding Fathers, basically, they were in the pocket of Rome. So we have to really think about that. Fact 2. Now this one is interesting, and you could spend a good amount of time, but you need to research. No entity on earth was expelled or suppressed by countries more than the Jesuits. They do a lot of educational and charity work to this day, but that's a front. They were expelled for engaging in these countries, over 80 of them, in carrying out subversive political plots against humanity to advance their own cause. And I've tried to point that out when we discuss Father Edmund Walsh from Georgetown, the creator of the School of Foreign Service, where many of our diplomats still come from. And then I started looking back at the history of where he was at and all of the things that he was involved in with creating Stalin and a number of different things in Baghdad and also Mexico. So he was a spy working with the CIA, just like Father Paolo Dal Oglio is doing that in Syria today. So check those two names out. Now, they were expelled from 1555 to 1931. Okay, let's just stop there. Expelled from at least 83 countries, cities, states, and whatever, for engaging in political intrigue. So how could a society rooted in this change overnight? They can't. They were involved in subversion plots against the welfare of states, of countries, according to records of Jesuit priests of repute, one being Thomas J. Campbell. Practically every instance of expulsion was for political intrigue, political infiltration, political subversion, and inciting political insurrection. So why do we allow them here? Because that's what they do. And they control, basically, are involved in most every aspect of our government and our world. They're known for deception, lying, infiltration, assassination, and revolution. And they've plotted to create wars all over the place. In the world, I mean, most every war that we've been involved with, I can lay odds that you can find a Jesuit behind the orchestration of that war. And in fact, there was a Jesuit priest, Francisco Borgia. Let me give you another quote. Third Jesuit Superior General. He said this: "We came in like lambs and we will rule like wolves. We shall be expelled like dogs and return like eagles." All right. Okay, we've done this. Fact 3, you must look at Hitler. Yes. And we've done this ad nauseum, and it just doesn't get it through people's heads. Hitler modeled the SS and his organizational structure on the Jesuits and the Roman Catholic Church. He said it. The SS organization, he said, had been constituted according to the principles of the Jesuit order. Edmund Paris researched that in The Secret History of the Jesuits, page 164. Walter Schellenberg, former chief of Nazi counterespionage, made this statement, quote, "The SS organization had been constituted by Himmler, leading member of the Nazi Party, according to the principles of the Jesuit order. Their regulations and the spiritual exercises prescribed by Ignatius Loyola were the model Himmler tried to copy." Exactly. Above all, Lenin even said that. He was killed by Stalin, who was put in by the Jesuit order and Western money to resurrect the Bolshevik revolution and put Stalin in power so he could kill millions, probably the biggest mass murder in history. And Lenin said this: "Far as I recall, the world has never known anything quite so splendid as the hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church." You know why? Because they're basically the Roman Empire. They structured themselves after the Roman Empire, and they are the Roman Empire of today. All they do is they're doing a little bit more deceitfully by covering it up by saying they're this religion. You know, they call the Pope Francis, he considers himself Christ on earth. You know, how many shows did we do on how the Pope became infallible? Wait till you read that story. And man, a priest from Germany, a bishop, wrote that book when he was 40, sent a copy and asked John Paul II to get rid of this infallibility idea that was created by a maniacal pope in the 1800s. And this priest, we've talked about it many times, died shortly thereafter the letter he sent to Pope John Paul II. The book is amazing. How the Pope became infallible. Just check that out. So we have Lenin talking about it. Hitler, God, how many times have I read this quote? And people just forget it. He said this: "I learned much of the order of the Jesuits," said Hitler. "Until now, there's never been anything more grandiose on the earth than the hierarchical organization of the Catholic Church. I transferred much of this organization into my own party. I am going to let you in on a secret. I am founding an order. In my burghs of the order, we will raise up a youth which will make the world tremble." Hitler then stopped, saying that he couldn't say any more. And where did you get that? Books were written on it. Hermann Rausching, former National Socialist chief of the government of Danzig, wrote that book in 1939, and that quote's on page 266, 267, 273, and there's much more there, and I could go on, so we'll just stop there. But that leads me into something, and we've gotten through 3 facts you have to know. We got 7 more to go, and probably there's 100 more you should know. But let me just interject this idea that the Nazis came through the rat lines, which we've shown even in court documents today, that were before the liberal Ninth Circuit in a case called Alperin v. Vatican Bank regarding the genocide of Jews, Romas, and people during remember that genocide in Croatia? And that case was brought in front of the Ninth Circuit, dropped. But there was testimony by a CIA undercover agent that he was there are documents that were even presented that the Vatican was allowing Nazis to flow through. They would give them papers and then they would be sent to Argentina, Canada, America, many still living here. So let's just check that out a minute and see what we, and I can give you a personal story on that. So I've got about 4 minutes on the break here, so let me say this. So there's been a lot lately in the news comparing Trump to Hitler, right? And that's left-wing stuff that comes out all the time. The concern is that a Nazi-type regime may be rising in America. Well, let me tell you something. The Nazi regime has been here a long, long time. They created Nassau. Just look at who's the head of that. In fact, following the Second World War, the government recruited Hitler's employees, adopted his protocols, embraced mindset about law and order, implemented his tactics, and began to lay the foundations of the rise of the Fourth Reich right here. Sound far-fetched? Historian Robert Gillespie recounts the Nazi police state was initially so admired for its efficiency and order by the world powers of the day that J. Edgar Hoover, then head of the FBI, actually sent one of his right-hand men, Edmund Patrick Coffey, in Berlin in 1938 at the invitation of Germany's secret police, the Gestapo. The FBI was so impressed by the Nazi regime that, according to the New York Times, in the decades after World War II, the FBI, along with government agency, aggressively recruited at least 1,000 Nazis, including some of Hitler's highest henchmen. Thus, they covered up this and brought Nazis over here with the help of the Vatican. And basically, they're here to this day. Many Nazis are still living here. Many of them are getting older, but they've given them everything. And I followed a story one time, and I'm going to show you that on the other side of the break. I got about a minute and a half here. I don't want to go overtime. But, thousands of Nazi collaborators, including the head of Nazi concentration camps, amongst others, were given secret visas through the rat lines and brought to America. Remember Project Paperclip? They were hired as spies, informants, working in our government to ensure their true identities and ties to Hitler's Holocaust machine would remain unknown. All the while, thousands of Jewish refugees were refused entry visas to the U.S. on the grounds that it could threaten national security. And the American taxpayer has been paying to keep these ex-Nazis on U.S. government payrolls ever since to this day. These ties you can find out immediately. So, this is something that's been going on for years. And let me tell you this. I went to a lake up in Idaho and went there to look at these. There's this lake in Idaho, way up in the Northern Idaho, where there's not a secret base, but it's the place where they take the nuclear submarines and they test them there. Nobody really knows about it. And I went there, and what I found out was very, very interesting. This was maybe, in 2006. And the lake's still there. They're still operating. And I think it'd be an interesting story to talk about, as well as, what I once learned regarding Otto Skorzeny, who was the bodyguard of Hitler, and he talked much about how George, the Daddy Bush, was not who he really says he was. Back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today, so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.
The following program is labeled dangerous and off limits by the Supreme Jesuit Command. But stand tall, people. Listen up, and you may just learn something.
Oh, dear Lord Jesus, this ain't happening, man. This can't be happening, man. This isn't happening.
Okay, let's get right back at it on the Investigative Journal. And we're talking about 10 important facts you need to know about the Jesuits. And we've done 3 of them, and we got onto the subject of the Vatican rat lines and how Nazis were given fake visas and basically were sent to countries like ours, were sent to Argentina, other places. And, you know, I tried to find out some things regarding that, and it led me to a lake in Idaho, and I'll get to that in a minute, because I want to give you one. Many people say, Greg, you find a Jesuit under every rock, and I found an article that you might want to read. Even it's in the Catholic Herald. That's a Catholic newspaper. This came out on Thursday, May 5th, 2016, and it's so. You know, you can Google this, Catholic Herald, and the head of the headline is Why Catholics Thrive in the CIA. The agency has been dubbed Catholics in Action because of the faithful so many faithful have occupied so many senior positions. But could their dominance be weakening, they say? Well, okay, go read the article. So there you go. So what I wanted to talk about, though, was this. Years ago, I was trying to trace all of the Vatican rat lines and some of the people. Where did these Nazis really go? And how, how did they get in? And an interesting story came across my desk, and it was regarding the bodyguard of Adolf Hitler named Otto Skorzeny, who died in Florida, and it was a deathbed confession to a man who was dating his daughter. And he had a whole bunch of, you can still go on the website, you can still find these articles. Just Google Otto Skorzeny, the investigative journal, Greg Szymanski interview, and you'll find this guy had all this information. And Skorzeny was telling the truth about certain things about Hitler, but also about Daddy Bush, George number 41. Now it's under, if you say anything about 41 and the Pope, you're considered a traitor. Interesting, 41 and his wife were at the Super Bowl in Houston, as well as the Pope giving a speech. Now, if you say anything, the Pope regarded as the greatest thing since sliced bread. And George Bush, the senior, 41, was stated to be the toughest man and the biggest patriot in the whole stadium. So if you say anything against them in the mainstream, you're considered a traitor. But is it possible that he was a traitor? And this deathbed confession, the confession by Otto Skorzeny, relayed to me by this man in Florida, was amazing. And he was stating that George Bush was not really the son of then Senator Bush. Okay, remember his father, who basically was involved with I.G. Farben and supporting the Nazis in World War II. He should have been thrown out as a senator, but basically was the adopted son. And he actually was the son of the accountant of Nikola Tesla, a German. That all of his records in the army, this idea that he was this war hero, and when you get to the point where he basically lost his plane and his crew died, but he ejected out of an airplane in World War II, there's another pilot that was in that same squadron that says that the whole story was different. And he actually killed his crew and ejected and wanted to become a fake hero so that he could then in the future become president. So it's a great story, and I wouldn't put it past him. So go and look up Otto Skorzeny. But along the way, during that story, I was getting some comments from people on my radio show, and they said, Greg, if you're looking for some Nazis, you got to go to Lake Pend Oreille. It's Oreille. Lake Pend Oreille. And this is a lake that the Navy uses as a place to try out their nuclear submarines. And around that lake are these big mansions, and there's several high-level Nazis that have been living there on the U.S. payroll, paid by taxpayers, living in mansions for years. And a lot of the locals know about it, so why don't you take a trip there? So I did. But let me explain what this base was. The U.S. Navy's submarine bases, folks, are some of the most high security installations in the world. But one of their most important and one of the most shadowy ones was not located on the ocean, but rather in this lake in landlocked Idaho. It's a very deep lake, about 1,500 feet deep. Very deep. It's a landlocked lake in Idaho, so I went there. But what is it? The Navy's Acoustic Research Detachment, ARD, at Bayview, Idaho, which is some 375 miles from the ocean, is where new submarine and surface ship shapes and subsystems are tested in a sub-scale environment that closely mimics the ocean. In other words, ARD Bayview is the Navy's lower key subsurface Area 51, and massive Lake Pend Oreille is a water base, is their water base, smaller and more friendlier than the Nellis Range complex that they also use. So the lake's depth is 1,150 feet. And I went there. Okay. And the truth is that this base has supported every major submarine design development for at least the last 85 years. And so I went there, and you go and you see this little military Navy compound, and you then see a place where they can dock, and it's not very big. And I tried to get in, and I wasn't allowed in. They said it was national security, asked me who I was, and I said I was a journalist wanting to do a story about what goes on here. And they said, well, that's impossible. You have to go through channels. And so I started to drive around the lake, and I saw all these wonderful, big, huge houses and a nice community, a beautiful area. Lake views like you wouldn't believe in Northern Idaho. And so I decided to stay for a day. So I went to a local hotel, shooting pictures, and was going, God, I'm not going to get much here. So I started talking to people, and I went out to dinner that night and sat at the bar and started talking to a couple locals. And I said, yeah, I'm here as a journalist, and I heard that there's some interesting people that live around the lakes. And the guy who blurts out, oh, you mean some of the Nazis? And he was, I'm going, okay, I'm in white supremacist land, so maybe they're concerned about it. And so this one guy wasn't wearing, he was just seemed like a normal guy. He says, I've lived around here my whole life, and I can tell you something. If you want to see some Nazi mansions, yeah, they live around here. They're very secretive. And he says, what are you doing tomorrow morning? And I said, well, I wanted to take some pictures to see if I could see some of these submarines. And I can't see. He says, well, you can see them. They surface during the day sometimes. And you see them come out of the water, then go down. And I'll even take you to one of the houses where this big Nazi lives. I said, all right. So got up the next morning, met him. We had breakfast. And he started taking me around, showing me, and he says, we go to this one compound, and I'm telling you, I said, well, how can I get in there? And they said, oh, you won't be able to get in. It's all chain link fence. They even have guards that come by, and this guy's been living here for 20 years, and all the stories about these Nazis are true, and there's a number of them around this whole lake. And I said, well, what about these submarines? And he said, well, let's keep watching. So we walked around, we went to lunch on this really nice place to eat, then we came back, and sure enough, I got 2 or 3 really nice pictures of these submarines coming up and then going down. I could see them. They'd surface and then go down. So basically, that was the end of the story. I couldn't get into the Nazi compounds. But really, the local guy was pretty good, as he stated. Yes, they've been here a long time, and so the story goes on. Okay, so let's get back. Got off on a tangent there, but it kind of related to the Jesuits and the Vatican rat lines and the Nazis brought here that are still working in our government to basically overthrow it in the future, and that relates to the coming World War III, which we'll get into later. If we don't have time today, I might not have time to go through all these 10 facts you need to know about the Jesuits, so we can continue tomorrow. But one of the counselors to President Trump came up with some really interesting statements, Steve Bannon, about the coming World War III, and it's worth noting. But anyway, let's get back to a fact that you need to know about the Jesuits. And I've talked to you about how they present themselves as the great educators. But for the past 450, 500 years, they have succeeded in establishing the largest network worldwide of schools and universities, and not only in our country but worldwide. And their alumni are, strangely enough, always end up in high-level positions in the government. It's quite interesting. If you check, and I'm doing a check once Trump's government gets together, we did it on Obama and showed that there were more Jesuits in high-level positions with Obama than there were with the president preceding him and even President Reagan. And one interesting fact about Reagan, before we get into the university story, is that Wasn't it interesting? And one of the facts you need to know about Reagan was that he instituted diplomatic relations formally with the Vatican, bringing an ambassador or nuncio office back to Washington after our diplomatic relations had been severed since the Vatican was outed as being behind the Lincoln assassination. Now, many patriots and government officials back then understood it, cut off relations, and that continued all the way through to Reagan. But it was also interesting that during the Reagan presidency, he was the first president, when they have their inauguration now, they go out to the west area of the White House, and each president faces the obelisk, the worshiping of Isis, which we've talked about. Check into the history of the obelisks and how Isis, the goddess of fertility, and this pagan goddess is really representative of the Washington Monument, like it is the obelisk in Rome and the one in London. So since Reagan, our presidents actually face that obelisk. Prior to that, they didn't. So that's an interesting fact. I think they're telling us who they really worship. And I don't think any president that's been selected since Kennedy has not been fully briefed on where he's coming from. And if he goes a little bit astray, he may be warned with a bullet, like Reagan was. Okay, so these schools that they've created have been able to shape and mold many of the famous world leaders. That's why I said they all work together at high levels. That's why I say they orchestrate these wars at high levels, telling their population one thing. Let's say the Russian people hear one thing, that America is an imperialist demon, while we here in our country hear about how China is the biggest enemy, or Iran. And so they're competing. They all work at the top levels to create this friction so that wars can be ignited just like the striking of a match. And so they're producing generations of political and religious leaders who are favorable to the Catholic agenda. Charles Spurgeon once said this. He stated this. He warned church ministers who are graduating from these universities that they keep back a portion of the gospel, having studied in the devil's new Jesuitical college. So go to Charles H. Spurgeon, A Solemn Warning of All Churches. And he did a number of sermons on that. And let me ask you this question. I'm going to refer to you to, let's see. Where is this page? I wanted to read this to you because it's quite interesting. We've talked about the ecumenical movement and how they've infiltrated churches in America to basically quash any criticism of the Vatican. And Bill Hughes, in his book, The Enemy Unmasked, gave you 6 things you should ask about your church to see if they're under the umbrella of this ecumenical movement, which is really Rome taking over Christianity. Because Catholicism, folks, is pagan, and it's a mixture of pagan and Christian beliefs, and it is not Christianity at all. Now, here's the 6 things he asked you to do. Is your church still protesting against the tyranny of the papacy? Ask your pastor that. 2, does your church still teach the papacy is the Antichrist? Or is it something that your church once taught, but now shies away from because it is not politically correct? 3, does your church engage in celebration-style church services that are more contemporary with the times and have more upbeat music? This was part of the papacy's plan at Vatican II in taking over churches. So does it become a rock concert when you go to church? 4, is your church forgetting their historic teachings and becoming more modern, casting away the old truths and as relics of the past? 5, are your church periodicals finding more and more good things to say about the papacy, even considering the Vatican leaders to be fine Christian people? And 6, is your church willing to join the ecumenical movement, even if it means sacrificing some basic teachings or principles that the church once believed. If your answer, folks, I'm going to say this, to your questions are yes, and if even to one of them or more, then I believe your church is being taken over by the papacy. And whatever Alberto Rivera, the Jesuit priest who talked about how that was his assignment, what he is saying is true. Now, back to the education. That's an important process. Please look into Jesuitical education. I've researched it all the way back to the 1500s and a little bit, before, when the Jesuits were formed, and found that they even started infiltrating theater performances back then. And that's where I began to question regarding Shakespeare. Who was he? Did he write these things? And he didn't. It can be traced, I think, and make a good argument that a number of Jesuit priests were behind the writing of the Shakespearean plays. And if you understand that they've also taken over Hollywood, it's something they've been doing a long, long time. So, the connections even go deep into Hollywood, and that's why you see this satanic element in Lady Gaga and Madonna and all these Katy Perry, and all of their worshiping of Lucifer comes forefront. And this is because the Jesuits were also involved in Jesuit theater way back when and have moved into Hollywood lock, stock, and barrel. Interesting stuff. You wonder where it comes from, don't you? I'm going to get through one more. And let's just say this. This is something I have always harped on. And I started researching all of the different presidents and heads of state that were involved in Jesuit intrigue and assassinated so that this New World Order could move along the centuries to where it is today. And many things can be said. When you look at I spent much time on President Lincoln, and I think if you go back to my own shows, you will find the case is astounding against the Vatican, and it never gets brought up today at all. And in fact, if you talk about it, you're considered a traitor. All of the movies, even Bill O'Reilly on Fox News with his, killing Lincoln, killing Reagan, all these things, they never get into this story, which is actually factual if you go back to some of the court cases that Lincoln was involved in, and much that was written back then. But it's all forgotten because they are caught up in the Jesuitical teaching and actually controlled by them. If they said one word of what I'm saying right now, they'd be fired. And they can't lose they're making $20 million, $30 million a year for getting on these cable networks now. It's incredible, isn't it? Agents of the Jesuits, I say, have been responsible for assassinating many heads of state in many countries over the centuries. They've attempted to suppress influence and meddling in their national affairs for years. Heads of state that are known to have been assassinated. William of Orange, King Henry III, Henry IV of France, Tsars Alexander I and Alexander II of Russia, President Lincoln, like I said, JFK, Mexican President Benito Pablo Juarez, are just to name a few. And when you start looking at this, and I'll leave it here, you can go to quotes by U.S. Army Brigadier General Thomas H. Harris, Rome's responsibility for the assassination of Lincoln. Now, where are all these generals and presidents today, Trump included, if they really start talking about the truth about what happened? They would really respect what these generals during the Civil War talked about and how they were the Rome was involved in fomenting the Civil War for a reason. And Thomas Harris, a well-respected brigadier general, author of the books Rome's Responsibility for the Assassination of Lincoln, stated this, quote, it would seem that the Jesuits had in mind from the beginning of the war, the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, to find an occasion for the taking of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And he said this: the favorite policy of the Jesuits is that of assassination. And it is totally amazing that, like I said in the beginning of the show, and we'll end it with my statement that I made earlier, this memory loss is astonishing. Have these people all just forgotten, people in power, people in our media, have all just forgotten all this stuff? And when someone brings it up, they're considered a traitor to the American way? Well, maybe they are the traitors of the American way, getting away with Jesuit intrigue right before your very eyes. And maybe you should take to heart what Michelangelo Tamburini, the Jesuit general in the 1700s, said. He said, we control the world, we control China, we control every part of the world without anybody knowing how we do it, right from this very office. And the office he was sitting in was at Borgo Santo Spirito Cinque, one that I walked by many times when I lived in Rome, the headquarters of the Jesuit general, the Black Pope, the Society of Jesus. They love to use, hide behind the name of Jesus. Secondly, first Jesuit Pope in the history. I always ask this question. Maybe one of you can answer it. Max is not feeling well. Maybe one of you can answer this. It is stated that the white pope, who is the Pope of Rome, takes orders from the black pope, who is the Jesuit general. Now we have the white pope, who's actually a black pope, and we have a black pope. Who's taking orders from who? We got two black popes, one masquerading as the white pope. And boy, when that happened, I said, we are in deep trouble. And we actually have another pope, black pope. He's out there in Syria somewhere helping Father Paolo Dell'Oglio, I guess, Father Kolvenbach, who just resigned. Usually they stay in office forever, and gave it over to the new black pope. That's an interesting thing. So they got a lot of popes out there now, don't they? And even Pope Benedict, he's around. They've got 4 of them now. They got 2 blacks, 2 whites, and 1 white masquerading as a black. Or no, 1 black masquerading as a white. Wow. And one of their what? Loyola, their first Jesuit general, said, Ignatius Loyola, he said, what's white is black, what black is white, if the church deems it to be that way. So he's saying, whatever the Pope of Rome says, no matter how wrong it is right. And we must obey. And boy, have they been doing that. And folks, don't miss my show tomorrow, because I'm going to back up what I said by some statements made by a counselor to Trump, Steve Bannon, regarding, I said we're going to be, I thought we're going to be in a big war within the next 5 years. I said I hope it doesn't come that way, but I'm going to give you some backup statements why I think that way. Back tomorrow on the Investigative Journal. Have a good night.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin Rapture Origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the left behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.